Welcome back, guys. It is Jack from the Magic Minds podcast, and today I have a deck tech on Hallar, the Firefletcher. So, Hallar is 1 red-green for a 3/3 legendary creature, Elf Archer. Has trample. Whenever you cast a spell, if that spell was kicked, put a +1/+1 counter on it, on Hallar. Then, Hallar deals damage equal to the number of +1/+1 counters on it to each opponent. So, it's a kicker counters deck. And so, I'm going to be telling you how I made this deck, and it's actually one of my favorites. So, let's get right into it. So, the first little section I'm going to be talking about is stuff that gets counters on Hallar, which is what we want to do. So, the first card that we have is Biogenic Upgrade. So it's 4 green for a sorcery. Distribute 3 +1/+1 counters among 1, 2, or 3 target creatures. Then double the number of +1/+1 counters on each of those creatures. So this is great because we get 3 counters on Hallar, and then we can double them, which is what we want to do, getting like 6 counters on them. In one turn. That's great. That's 6 damage to each opponent when we cast a kicker spell. So that's why that card is great. The next one that we have is Rishkar, Pima Renegade. So it's 2 and a green for a 2/2 legendary creature, Elf Druid. When Rishkar, Pima Renegade enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. Then each creature you control with a counter on it has tap, add green to your mana pool. So this, as you all know probably, that is great because it's giving you mana, and I guess you could tap Hallar for mana because it's not going to want to attack. It's just going to deal damage for the win, and it gets 2 counters, which is great, or 2 counters. If you want, you're most likely going to do that. So yeah, that is great because it's ramp also, but it's also putting counters on our guys. So that's really good. And this card is one of the best cards in the deck. The next one that I have is Hardened Scales. So it's 1 to green for an enchantment. If 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be placed on a creature you control, that many +1 +1/+1 counters are placed on it instead. So if we place 3 counters on it, it'll be 4 instead. So the reason this card is great because obviously it just adds more counters, and that can really be effective throughout the game. So that's the reason why that is probably one of the best cards in the deck. Now I have another great card that is like Rishkar, Pima Renegade, but it's Zhang Yanggu, Wildcrafter. It's 2 and a green for a 3 loyalty legendary Planeswalker. Each creature you control with a +1/+1 on it, +1 counter on it, has tap, add 1 mana of any color. So that's good. You can add red, not just green. You can -1, put a +1 counter on target creature. So in some ways it can be better than Rishkar. In some ways it can't because it's great because our stuff taps for 1 mana if it has a counter, so Hallar can usually tap for 1 mana, and you can minus it to put a counter on something. So that's the reason why that card is in the deck. So the next one is Solidarity of Heroes. So it's 1 to green for an instant. It has Strive. Solidarity of Heroes cost 2 more to cast for each target beyond the first. And then choose any number of target creatures, double the number of +1/+1 counters on each of them. So the reason this is great, it's 2 mana, basically double counters on Hallar. And since we're most likely not going to do multiple targets with this, you don't have to pay for the Strive, which is great because 2 mana double is great. So yeah, that's really good. The next card that I think is really good and can be one of the best cards in the deck is Increasing Savagery. It's 2 green for a sorcery. Put 5 +1/+1 counters on target creature. If Increasing Savagery was cast from a graveyard, put 10 +1/+1 counters on it instead. And has flashback for 5 green. So 5 counters on something and then 7 mana, 10 counters on something. That is just super good because that's all you want to do with this deck. Put a ton of counters on Hallar, make her huge, so then you can just cast a kicker spell and deal a ton of damage. So that is, I think, one of the best cards in the deck. The next one we have is really good too. It doesn't put counters on them, but it does help us with card draw, and that's Snake Umbra. So it's 2 and a green for an enchantment. You can enchant a creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has, whenever this creature deals damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. And that's damage. It's not combat damage. So that's great because we're not dealing combat damage with Hallar. And whenever it goes to each player with Hallar, so you can draw 3 cards every time you cast a kicker spell. If it has counters on it, Hallar, which most likely it will, considering this deck is stacked full of +1 counter synergies. So that card can come in useful plenty of times. The next card is also really good. It is Verdurous Gear. So it's 3 green for a 4/4 artifact creature construct. Has trample. When Verdurous Gear enters the battlefield, distribute 4 +1/+1 counters among any number of target creatures you control. So it's great. You're most likely not going to distribute them with this deck, but you can if you want. But we're most likely going to put all 4 of them on Hallar, which is great because that's obviously what we want to do with the deck. So great addition. The next one that we have is the First Iron Games. So it's 2 green for Enchantment Saga. It has 1, 2, 3, or 4. And so 1 is create a 1/1 human soldier creature token. 2 is put 3 +1/+1 counters on target creature you control. 3, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw 2 cards. 4, create a gold token. So we're mainly looking at 2 and 3 here. So 2 is great because you can put 3 counters on a creature, what we want to do. And then 3 is great because if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, which you're most likely going to do because Hallar is a 3/3 when it comes in. So that you can draw 2 cards. So that's great. Drawing cards is what is good because it's good. So now we're gonna look at a few more +1 counter guys, and then we're gonna look at some kicker spells. So the next +1 counter one is 2 and a green. It's Evolution Sage, 2 and a green for a 3/2 creature elf druid. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, proliferate. So choose any number of permanents and/or players, then give each of them another counter of each kind they already have. So Evolution Sage is great. It doesn't help you a ton, but it adds counters to Hallar, and that helps us deal more damage when we want to with our kicker spells. So this is great. Again, like I told you, it's not the best, but it works. It's good. So this one is Lifecrafter's Gift. So it's 3 and a green for an instant. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Then put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. So we're basically putting 2 +1 counters on Hallar. And like I said, that's the main goal of this deck, and that is great. So now we're on to, by far, the best card in the deck. It is Hydra's Growth. So it's 2 and a green for an enchantment. Enchant creature. When Hydra Growth enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on enchanted creature. At the beginning of your upkeep, double the number of +1/+1 counters on enchanted creature. At your upkeep, so that's every turn, you're doubling the counters on Hallar. And whenever I've played with this deck, this card has won me games. So that is why I'm giving it the spotlight of this deck. Hydra Growth. Very good. So we're going to talk about 3 more cards for the +1 counter theme. So the next card is Blade of the Blood Chief. So it's one colorless for artifact equipment. Whenever a creature dies, put a +1 counter on equipped creature. If equipped creature is vampire, put 2 +1 counters on it instead. So it's obviously Hallar's not a vampire, so we're not going to get the 2 counters, but whenever a creature dies, you're putting a counter on Hallar. And that's going to be often a lot, because in Commander there's a lot of removal and board wipes, so if you get this out early on Hallar, it'll be a great addition. Get her some counters. So the next one is Arbor Animate. So it's 1 green for an instant. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. That creature gains reach into end of turn. So that reach doesn't really matter, but we're putting 1 counter on Hallar, and 1 may not seem a lot, but it can help us adding counters, which is great, what we want to do with the deck. And so, the last one that we have for the +1 counter theme is Pollen Bright Druid. So it's 1 green for a 1/1 creature elf druid. When Pollen Bright Druid enters the battlefield, choose 1. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or proliferate. So if it doesn't really matter, but if Hallar already has a counter on it, you can proliferate, or if she doesn't have a counter, you can put a +1 counter on it. So that's it for the +1 counter theme. Moving on to the kicker spells. So some great kicker spells that we have. The first one that I think is really powerful and is a great ramp card is Grow from the Ashes. So it's 2 and a green for a sorcery. Has Kicker 2. And if you don't know what Kicker is, you may pay an additional 2 as you cast this spell. Search your library for a basic land card. Put it onto the battlefield untapped. Then shuffle your library. If this spell was kicked, instead search the library for two basic lands cards. Put them onto the battlefield untapped. So, obviously you're thinking 5 mana, 2 lands, but they come in untapped, which can come in handy. And 3 mana, a land untapped is already good, and with this deck, you can get 2 lands untapped plus a decent amount of damage with Hallar, if not a lot. So, that's why this card, I think, is one of the best ramp cards for kicker decks. The next one, I think, is also one of the best kicker guys. It's Thicket Elemental. So 3 green for a 4/4 creature elemental. Has kicker for 1 green. When Thicket Elemental enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, you may reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card. If you do, put that card onto the battlefield and shuffle all other cards revealed this way into your library. So, it is 7 mana when kicked, but you can get a creature card from your library onto the battlefield and deal a decent amount of damage, if not a lot of damage, with Hallar. So, Thicket Elemental is great. Next one is Ballast Gorger. So it's 2 green for a 4/4 creature beast. Has kicker 4. And when Ballast Gorger, if Ballast Gorger was kicked, it enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. So if it was kicked, it entered the battlefield with 3 counters, being a 7/7. But it does cost 8 mana with the kicker, which is a lot sometimes, and can be hard to get 8 mana soon in the game. So the next one that we have is Raeleen Migration. So it's 1 green for sorcery. It has kicker 4. Create 2 1/1 green Raeleen creature tokens. If the spell was kicked, create 4 of those instead. So, obviously, it has kicker, and you can create Raeleens. Raeleen is not what we want to create, but it has kicker, and that's all we really care about, and it's great. So the next one is Shivan Fire. So it's 1 red for an instant. No, it's 1 red for an instant. Has kicker 4. Shivan Fire deals 2 damage to target creature. If this spell is kicked, it deals 4 damage to that creature instead. So obviously, if you look at this card, it's kind of not that good. But in a kicker deck, it's pretty good. Because it has kicker, obviously, and can deal a lot of damage, and you can deal 4 damage to a creature, which can be useful at times, but not a lot. So, the last kicker spell, well, no, not the last one, we have 2 more. So, we have Crowson Druid, so it's 2 and a green for a 2/3 creature centaur druid. It's 4 and a green to kicker, so that's 5 mana kicker. It's a lot. When Crowson Druid enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, you gain 10 life. So that's 8 mana, gain 10 life. Not very good, but it does have kicker. It's 8 mana kicked. So, like I said before, that can be a lot of mana if you don't have a ton of ramp in the deck. So, there is one more kicker spell, and then we'll move on to one of the removal spells. So the last kicker spell is Gift of Growth. So it's 1 green for an instant. Kicker 2. Untap target creature. It gets +2/+2 until end of turn. If this spell is kicked, that creature gets +4/+4 until end of turn. So this is obviously good because you can untap a creature and gets +2/+2. You're most likely not going to do Hallar with this because you're not aiming to attack. Maybe unless you want to block, but this might just be a random creature just to get that kicker and doing a good amount of damage with Hallar. So the next one, now we're moving on to one of the removal spells in the deck, and so this one is from the new set Ikoria. It's Barrier Breach. So it's 2 and a green for an instant. Has cycling 2, and you can exile up to 3 target enchantments. So, the reason this card is very good is because you can exile 3 enchantments for 3 mana, it's an instant, and you can cycle it if you need cards. That is great for any green deck because you can have that great removal. And so, the next one is some ramp, and is great for kicker decks. It is Elfheim Druid. So it's 1 green for a 0/2 creature elf druid. And you can just add a green regularly, you can tap it. Or you can tap it to add 2 green, spend this mana only to cast kicked spells. Now obviously there's a lot of kicker spells in this deck, so this is great because we're going to be wanting to cast because we're going to be casting a lot of kicker spells. This can help us cast them with 2 extra mana, and especially since some of them cost 8 mana, which is a lot. So yeah, we have a couple more cards. The next one is a Planeswalker. It's our only one in the deck. It is Domri, Anarch of Bolas. So it's 1 red green for a 3 loyalty Planeswalker, Domri. Creatures you control get +1/+0. That's its static ability. And +1, add red or green. Creature spells you cast this turn can't be countered. -2, target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. So, this is great because it gives our stuff +1/+0. And you can obviously add mana, and they can't be countered in that turn. But it's -2, you can remove a creature most likely because Hallar is going to have a ton of power, with all your counters on her. So you can basically destroy any creature you want, which is great. Yeah, so The last card is one of the lands that I'm going to talk about. Is Mosswarp Bridge. So it's the land, and it taps for green, but it has Hideaway. This land enters the battlefield tapped. When it does, look at the top 4 cards of your library, exile 1 face down, then put the rest on the bottom of your library. And then, so you can tap it to add a green. And then you can pay 1 green to tap it, 1 green and tap it. You may play the exiled card without paying its mana cost, if creatures you control have total power 10 or greater. And Hallar is most likely going to have power 10, and if it doesn't, you're most likely going to have another creature on the board that hopefully can get you up to 10 power, casting the card that you got without paying its mana cost. So Mosswarp Bridge is great. And so yeah, thanks guys for tuning in to my deck tech on Hallar the Firefletcher, and we'll see you next time. Remember to keep magic on your minds. See ya!